Thank you so much for making time to be with us this afternoon to launch the Rwanda Economic Update, the 17th edition, which also examines the role of the private sector in closing the infrastructure gap. We hope you will enjoy the discussions. Before I move to the first item of our agenda, I would like to make just a couple of housekeeping announcements. All our interactions are going to be through the WebEx and the YouTube chats. So you're free to fill your questions anytime during the discussion. And I would like to remind our distinguished panelists to please remember to unmute yourselves when you are going to speak, and also remember to mute yourself after you are done. So it is now my pleasure to welcome our host, Madame Roland Price, the World Bank Country Manager for Rwanda, to make her opening remarks, and of course, invite our keynote speaker. Over to you, Roland.
Rogers, thank you so much. Miriwe, turabishimye mngese. Ambassador Clavier Gatete, Minister of Infrastructure, Ms. Claire Akamanzi, Chief Executive Officer of the Rwanda Development Board, Ms. Amina Rakunda, Chief Economist at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, distinguished government representatives, distinguished private sector representatives, colleagues from development partner agencies, and other distinguished guests. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the 17th edition of the Rwanda Economic Update. For those of you who may be new to this, what is the Rwanda Economic Update? It is a report that is published twice a year. The update analyzes recent economic developments and prospects, as well as provides an in-depth examination of selected economic and policy issues of priority for Rwanda. The current edition of the update focuses on the role of the private sector in closing the infrastructure gap in Rwanda. The update is a collective endeavor. It draws on data reported by the government and additional information collected by the World Bank Group in its regular economic monitoring and policy dialogue. It involves staff from several units of the World Bank Group with strong collaboration from different government institutions. In this particular edition, I would like to acknowledge and appreciate the contribution of key data by the Rwanda Development Board and close collaboration with the International Finance Corporation in the preparation of the report. What does this report capture? The COVID-19 pandemic has been a significant drag on Rwanda's economy. In 2020, GDP fell by approximately 3.4%, compared to an anticipated expansion of 8% before the COVID-19 outbreak. Fiscal space has narrowed considerably as the COVID crisis has boosted fiscal needs and public debt. It really means that the government has less money to spend. Rwanda has had a high rate of public investment over the past few years, equaling approximately 13% of GDP in 2019, and this in fact was the third highest in the world as a share of GDP, coming behind Timor-Leste and Afghanistan. Despite significant infrastructure investments, Rwanda maintains a substantial infrastructure gap and will need to increase investment further to achieve its development goals. The 17th edition of the REU essentially makes the case that if government were to maximize all traditional sources of finance, its own resources through domestic revenue mobilization or taxation, as some of you might know in the usual parlance, and external financing through loans and grants from development partners, it would still not have enough to afford to finance all of its public investment projects, of which infrastructure is the lion's share. And thus, that's why we have focused on infrastructure in this report. increasing private sector financing of infrastructure thus becomes critical for Rwanda to achieve its development goals. And while the report acknowledges that Rwanda has made important progress in attracting private sector participation to infrastructure in recent years, it suggests that there is still margin to improve this further. Against that backdrop, we have a few recommendations. There are a couple of key priorities for reform, we think, for the government going forward. First, maintaining public debt at sustainable levels is key to help reduce the country's vulnerability to external shocks and to preserve country risk levels. Second, building a robust multi-sector public-private partnership project pipeline targeting sectors with clearly identified service needs, such as transport, water and sanitation, waste management, irrigation, and housing, is also important. Third, capitalizing further on Rwanda's foreign direct investment regulatory framework, considered one of the best in the continent, in order to attract FDI to support public infrastructure specifically. And fourth, fostering domestic private capital mobilization through deepening access to long-term finance and designing innovative financing mechanisms to crowd in domestic and regional funds. Finally, we suggest rebalancing the investment strategy from prioritizing large strategic capital-intensive projects toward projects that are critical to broad-based social returns, to boost the potential of public infrastructure, to reduce inequality, and to reduce poverty. As you know, poverty and inequality are two of the most critical concerns for the World Bank in its mandate. So let me tell you a little bit about what the World Bank's activities are in promoting private sector investment in infrastructure in Rwanda. The World Bank Group, in its mission of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity, has deployed a variety of instruments to create an enabling environment for private sector participation and to support the development of sustainable and inclusive infrastructure. The World Bank's infrastructure portfolio is approximately $1 billion supporting energy, transport, housing, urban development, to name a few. To facilitate access to finance for firms, one of the key obstacles we hear for firms catalyzing and becoming bigger and doing more business, with a view to accelerating a green, resilient, and inclusive post-COVID recovery, the World Bank has recently approved an operation that will help to further capitalize Rwanda's Economic Recovery Fund in the amount of $150 million. In conclusion, I very much look forward to what I hope will be a fruitful discussion of the challenges presented by the government's shrinking fiscal space and the need to support critical investment for the country's long-term development goals. And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this afternoon. Ambassador Gatete really needs no introduction, but let me remind you of some of the many ways in which he has served the government and people of Rwanda most recently. Ambassador Clavier Gatete was appointed as the Minister of Infrastructure in April of 2018. Prior to this appointment, he served as Minister of Finance and Economic Planning from February 2013. He had previously served as the Governor of the National Bank of Rwanda, having previously served prior to that as its Deputy Governor. Ambassador Gatete also served as Rwanda's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Iceland from November 2005 to December 2009. And this is only the last 15 to 16 years of his career. With these credentials, you can see why there was no other contender for delivering this keynote address. We are very pleased that Ambassador Gatete has accepted our invitation. And Ambassador, the floor is yours. Over to you. You're still muted, sir.
Thank you very much, World Bank Country Manager. The way you introduced me, it seems I'm supposed to be retiring from the work that you mentioned. And should be leaving it to young people like the CEO of RDB to take this one forward. But thank you very much. The RDB CEO and cabinet member, the World Bank Regional Director, the World Bank Country Manager, IFC Country Manager, development partners, stakeholders, and colleagues, good afternoon. I'm delighted to officiate the launch of the 17th edition of Rwanda Economic Update under the theme, the role of the private sector in closing the infrastructure gap. First of all, I appreciate World Bank's efforts to made towards this publication. This helps us to monitor the performance of economic development across greater sectors of our country. This edition comes at a time when Rwanda, like many other countries, has been severely affected by COVID-19 crisis. The country's growth momentum has been interrupted by the pandemic as the government is laying strategies to contain the spread of coronavirus. Ladies and gentlemen, it is well known that infrastructure development is a critical prerequisite for economic growth and contributes significantly towards the realization of the country's aspirations. Rwanda's rapid growth over the past 2 decades has been driven by large public investments. External financing through grants, concessional and non-concessional borrowing played an important role in financing public investments. These investments have translated into substantial infrastructure projects across different sectors and positively impacted the living standards of Rwandans. But a further increase in infrastructure investment is necessary to meet the country's development targets as stipulated in the NST1, Vision 2050, and SDGs. However, infrastructure needs for a growing economy like ours is way beyond what the government alone can handle. We need significant private sector investment to sustain our development. The government has therefore put in place an enabling environment to encourage private sector participation in the multi-sector development and acceleration of our growth, as Rwanda envisions to become an upper middle income country by 2035 and a high income country by 2050. This will require double-digit growth rates over the period up to the year 2050. To achieve this, Rwanda will need to attract and sustain high private investment induced by domestic savings that are projected to increase up to 30% over the period of our Vision 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, although the private sector is currently constrained by many factors, such as high cost of financing, its contribution to economic growth cannot go unnoticed. Examples of such investment and partnership with private sector can be seen in energy, water, sanitation, transport, and housing sectors. In the energy sector, the private sector has played a significant role in increasing access to electricity, where off-grid access moved from 1% in 2012 to 15% in 2020, with more than 20 private solar companies registered in Rwanda to provide solar home systems and mini-grids, particularly in rural areas. On this, government of Rwanda has also established a renewable energy fund of about $49 million under the support of World Bank to ensure that beneficiaries can have access to cheap loans. Key private sector players, like independent power producers, also played a considerable role in increasing electricity generation. These include Kivuat, producing 26 megawatts from methane gas, Hakan, developing 80 megawatts from peat, Shema Power, developing 56 megawatts from methane gas, Gigawatt operating 8.5 megawatts from solar, Rwanda Mountain Tea operating many micro hydro power plants, Ngari Energy developing hydro power plants, among so many others. In the water and sanitation sector, the government entered into a PPP arrangement with Metito for the construction of Kanzenze water treatment plant, which is now operational with installed capacity of 40,000 cubic meters per day. Many more private operators are also engaged in water supply systems management and maintenance in rural areas. In sanitation, the whole value chain is operated by private sector, and the government of Rwanda is also in the process of establishing a PPP for proper management of Nduba landfill in Kigali. In the transport sector, the government of Rwanda has partnered with Qatar Airways for the construction and management of Bugesera International Airport. In addition, the introduction of drones to assist in health services across the country is purely operated by private investors. Still in air transport, an aviation academy has been established under a public-private partnership for aircraft maintenance and repair and the training of pilots, engineers, and airline crew. Government of Rwanda is also finalizing negotiations with a private company on the establishment of a Kigali Ring Road, which will be a toll road under PPP arrangement. In the water transport, we have seen involvement of private sector in manufacturing of boats, operating maritime transport, and tourism. And in urbanization and human settlement sector, private investors are being mobilized to invest in affordable housing, and the government of Rwanda provides the basic infrastructure in the sites, including access roads, electricity, water, street lighting, and ICT. Affordable housing fund of about 150 million has also been established in Belde to leverage the construction of affordable homes. The above examples show that it is possible to partner with the private sector to invest in infrastructure, but we still need scale. Ladies and gentlemen, the question is to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to attract more private sector funding, both domestic and foreign, in the development of our infrastructure? How can we mobilize cheap financial resources from international financial institutions and development financial institutions for private sector development? Thirdly, how do we mobilize long-term domestic savings from investment in infrastructure? The answers to the above questions should include de-risking infrastructure projects for private sector investment, targeted support to private investors by international financial institutions and development financial institutions, and tapping into domestic long-term resources such as pension funds, long-term savings, and long-term investment funds as we establish Rwanda to become a financial hub. Mobilizing such a critical ladies and gentlemen, with these few remarks, I would like to once again thank the World Bank for preparing this economic update and organizing this important event. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for your very informative and insightful remarks. Most of you know Calvin Zebaze, GeoFac. It's not new to you, as just a few months ago, he was presenting the 16th edition of the Rwanda Economic Update. Calvin is the senior economist, country senior economist, and one of the authors of the new edition, the 17th edition of the Rwanda Economic Update, which is also examining the role of the private sector in closing the gap, the infrastructure gap. It's my pleasure now to invite Calvin to take us through the content of the report. Over to you, Calvin.
Calvin, you're muted. Can't hear a word.
Thank you very much, Rogers, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. Thanks to all the participants for joining us this afternoon for the launch of the Rwanda Economic Update. on the role of the private sector in closing the infrastructure gap in Rwanda. Before I proceed with the presentation, just allow me to acknowledge the many contributions and support we receive for this work from both the World Bank side and the government. Just quickly to thank Vivek, the manager, for the very strong strategic support to the team, and the peace with my colleague, the co-leader for this report. I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of other teams within the World Bank, the Global Macro and Debt team, the IFC, a very strong team that contributed to this, the infrastructure and the financing team, and the PPP's team of the World Bank. From the government side, I just would like to thank again MINECOFIN, Rwanda Development Board, as well as the Ministry of Infrastructure for the strong, very close collaboration in providing precious information, but also providing feedback and a very useful comment on the report. Our presentation is going to be structured around 4 main points. The first one, discuss very quickly, in fact, what has been the implication of the ongoing crisis on the fiscal, the fiscal situation in Rwanda. The second point is about the need of public investment in Rwanda in the post-COVID era. The third point would be about the financing of the public investment in the post-COVID era, with special focus on the public infrastructure. We will close the presentation with a couple of recommendations in terms of how to improve the participation of the private sector in the financing of infrastructure in Rwanda. Before that, please allow me to talk a little bit about a couple of key messages that are emerging from this report. The first message will be that the COVID pandemic still ongoing, unfortunately, really exacerbated existing fiscal challenges in Rwanda, contributing substantially to narrow the fiscal space of the country. The second message is that despite large investment, Rwanda need to increase further infrastructure investment in the country in order to be able to achieve its development goals. The third message is that looking ahead, increased private sector financing will be critical for Rwanda to close the infrastructure gap. And the fourth is that maintaining fiscal sustainability is really critical to be sure that the country is being preserved for that we are preserving the country risk. The final message here is that it will be very important to really prioritize the rural related infrastructure in order to improve, to accelerate the poverty and inequality reduction in the country. Let us move to the first part of our presentation, which is about the COVID crisis and the fiscal challenges. The main message here is really that the crisis has amplified challenges that were already there in Rwanda. So the graph that you have here is a graph that is showing us the evolution of the public debt in the recent decade in the country, as well as the evolution of the public investment. So we can see very clearly that in the decade before the crisis, before the COVID crisis, the debt increased substantially, in Rwanda to support an equally important and increase in the public investment. As we know, as the minister already noticed, this increase in public investment support a very strong growth that Rwanda enjoyed in the recent 2 decades. Once the crisis hit, unfortunately, the trend of increasing debt was accelerated, and we now have a situation where the debts, the public debt ratio over the GDP is moving from 61% in 2019 to 71% in 2020. As we know, the government needed during the crisis to spend a little bit more to support households that were in need, to support the private sector, and also, in fact, to respond to the health crisis. And all this being done in an environment where we have declining activity and declining revenue for the government, which create this situation. And going forward, it's projected that the debt of the country is going to be at 81% of GDP in 2023. Just to give you a comparison, a reference to understand this, before the crisis in 2019, the projection was that the debt of Rwanda, in fact, will peak in 2021 at 57% of GDP. Another way to understand the challenges, in fact, of the fiscal situation in Rwanda, just to see with this graph here, that is capturing the tax years that will be needed to pay the entire debt of the country. So we can see that in 2012, the country will have needed only the equivalent of 1.7 years of tax collection to pay back his entire debt. In 2020, what is going to be needed is going to be more than 4.5 years of tax collection in order to pay back the entire debt of the country. Let us move to the second part of the presentation. Now that we are seeing this relatively constrained fiscal space, what are the needs that the country is going to face in the coming years? Before talking about the need, it's really important to acknowledge the extraordinary effort that Rwanda made in recent decades about pushing for very useful public investment. As we know, as the minister underscored very well, Rwanda needs significant infrastructure investment to achieve its development goals. The estimate is that 40%, more than 40% of the GDP of infrastructure investment per year is needed for the government to achieve the sustainable development goals. And if we take into account the level of the effort that has been made in the past, if we take into account the level of investment that were being made in the country just a year before the crisis, there will still be an effort, an extra effort of investment to be made for the government to achieve that goal, in fact. And the estimate is that that gap will be around 8% of GDP of infrastructure per year for the country to achieve the sustainable development goals. The main sources of this gap from the sectors, the sector that you are seeing in this graph, like ICT, energy, transport, and water. I would also underscore the fact that the infrastructure are not the only area where the country will have the needs. Our Rwanda economic update of last January underlined very well that we also have needs in the area of human capital investment. However, for this special number of Rwanda economic update, our focus is just going to be on the infrastructure, on infrastructure investment. Let us move to the third part of the presentation, which is about how to finance those public investment needs in the post-COVID area where we have such constrained fiscal space. We have to say that traditionally in Rwanda, like just in many other countries in the world, infrastructure financing has been heavily supported by public resources. And in this case, it's around 71% of the public infrastructure has been supported by public resources. And given the current situation, the analysis from the report, in fact, is showing very clearly that this situation is no longer sustainable. And the graph that you have here is showing us the impacts of increased infrastructure investment on the public debt. And the scenario that we have here is a scenario where we use the borrowing, the government will borrow the money to close the infrastructure gap needed for the sustainable development goal. What we can see here very clearly, in fact, is that under the baseline scenario where no effort is made, in fact, to close the infrastructure gap, the debt situation in 2024, the debt to GDP ratio should be 78%. Okay, so that's 2024 in the situation where there's no any effort to increase the level of infrastructure. However, if the government, in fact, were to make an extra effort to borrow extra money and rely only on that to close the entire gap, the level of debt will increase just in 2024 to more than 100% of GDP. And we have to say here that the government target in terms of debt in medium term is 65% of GDP. So this is simply not doable to think that we could rely on borrowing in order to close this gap. We also try to assess a couple of other scenarios of public financing. Let's take, for example, the grant financing. Over the past couple of years, on average, the level of grant to the government has been around 5% of the GDP. So our estimate is that if the government were just to rely only on the grant financing to close the entire infrastructure gap, this will require for that grant to more than double, which is something that will not be feasible. As we know, the level of grant has actually been declining in recent years. We also assess the scenario where the domestic revenue mobilization, in fact, could be used to close the infrastructure gap. For that to be the case, the actual effort of revenue mobilization in Rwanda, which is already extraordinary, representing around 16% of GDP, will have to increase to more than 25% of GDP. So this actually already higher than level of many developed countries. That's the first. And the second, in our assessment, we see that that type of level of increase in the revenue mobilization will actually have adverse impact on household and economic activities. And I will have to acknowledge one caveat here, though. What we are simulating, what we are assessing our analysis is increase in the revenue mobilization through taxation increase. There are other ways, in fact, to increase revenue mobilization, increasing, for example, the taxation base, increasing, for example, the efficiencies of tax collection without increasing the rate. We did not assess that here. Now, what is that the discussion we just had is telling us? It's basically that to close the infrastructure gap in Rwanda, we will require substantial increase in the private sector investment. So if, for example, we were to consider all the sources of funding from the public and consider that those sources of funding are being used at the maximum, talking about the grant, the government borrowings, and the potential increase in domestic taxation. So these sources will only allow the government to close around 40% of the infrastructure gap, meaning that the private sector, this just telling us that the private sector is going to have to increase substantially to support here. As of now, our estimate shows that the private sector has been contributing to around 29% to the total public infrastructure in the country. The good news, however, is that there's an important potential for private sector investment increase medium term in Rwanda. So our analysis suggests that the private sector financing of infrastructure in Rwanda could potentially increase between 1.4 to 6.4% of GDP per year if necessary reforms are undertaken to strengthen the institutions and the regulatory framework of the private sector and private sector financing of infrastructure investment. The IFC also identified potential for private sector investment in Rwanda that amount to more than $500 million for the 5 next year. And this potential will be in the sector of transport, housing, energy, and ICT. These are the sectors where we have substantial development gaps, but also currently have infrastructure gap that can be bridged through private sector solutions. We also, in this report, ask the question of the impact of the infrastructure development on poverty and inequality. The overall message is really that although this investment in infrastructure are beneficial to all population groups, it seems in Rwanda to benefit a little bit more to urban area and the richest. In fact, the graph that we have here is about a simulation of the impacts of a potential increase of infrastructure by 1% of GDP. So we have two parts of the graph. One part of the graph, each part corresponding to one scenario. So the first scenario, which corresponds to the left part of the graph, is where we are increasing that infrastructure investment following the traditional models, basically meaning that we are keeping in our analysis the linkages that exist between the current infrastructure and different components of the economy. Okay, so the second scenario is a situation where we are not doing exactly that. We modify a little bit the traditional model and have an extra 10% and make sure that 10% of that increase in infrastructure investment go to the agriculture and agriculture related infrastructure. So then we assess the result on different sectors of activity in the economy: agriculture, green, industry, yellow, and services in blue here. So under the first scenario, you can see very well that under the traditional infrastructure model, the services is going to generate a gain that will be around 4 times higher than what we have in agriculture. The industry, in fact, is going to have a gain that will be around 2 times what we have in agriculture. However, when you move to a model where you have 10%, you make sure that 10% of those resources, in fact, are going to be allocated to through infrastructure, through agricultural infrastructure, meaning irrigation or infrastructure that are linking a rural area to urban areas. In that case, we have a more balanced picture, even if the services continue to be the dominant one. So here, what we have is just the direct implication from the previous slide, where we can see that under the two scenarios, the poverty reduction is going to be stronger, obviously, when you have a pro-agricultural infrastructure. That's very clear from this graph here, where the yellow represents where we are showing, in fact, the number of people that will be out of the poverty as a result of increase of 1% of GDP in the infrastructure investment. The last part of our presentation is about the recommendations. So what are the key recommendations to boost private sector financing of infrastructure, but also, in fact, to make sure that infrastructure is really contributing to poverty reduction and inequality reduction? There are 4 areas of action here. The first one is to promote macro stability. The second one is to further strengthen the private sector regulatory framework. The third is to mobilize domestic private capital for infrastructure. And the fourth is to develop a more inclusive infrastructure investment strategy. Let us discuss that a little bit further here. Regarding the first area of recommendation, macroeconomic stability, it's very clear that as we are still facing the crisis, the near-term priority cannot be for the fiscal sustainability. The government will need, in fact, in the short term, to continue to support the household needs, the enterprises, and respond to the health crisis. However, in the medium term, as the crisis abates, it will be really crucial, in fact, to adopt a really credible fiscal sustainability plan that will allow the government, in fact, to increase the revenue. And to that extent, the current government plan of mobilizing revenue in the medium term, if implemented properly, could be very useful. So the government will also have to adopt a spending control measures that are credible. And the collaboration that the government has now with the World Bank to produce a public expenditure review can be very useful here, because that is going to provide a recommendation in some of the area where savings in terms of how in terms of some of the area of saving, some of the area of efficiency improvement, and some of the area of prioritization. Let's talk about the second area of recommendation, which is about improving the quality of regulatory framework. The report, in fact, is discussing how the regulatory framework could be improved in terms of PPPs for the FDI, but also for the SOEs that play an important role in Rwanda. But here we are focusing mainly in this presentation on the PPPs that represent by far the most important part of the most important channel through which the private sector operate in infrastructure in Rwanda. So one key recommendation here is to limit the initiation of PPPs project via unsolicited proposal, and to the extent feasible, subject such project to competitive bidding. It will be important to build capacity within a government in terms of designing, negotiating, and managing PPPs. And finally, something that was also underscored by Roland, would be important to develop a robust multi-sector PPPs project in Rwanda, targeting sectors that clearly identify services needs such as transport, water, irrigation, and housing sectors. The third area of recommendation is about mobilizing domestic private sector financing. And I could almost skip this slide because all these recommendations, in fact, were already discussed by Honorable Minister, meaning that it's very important, in fact, to deepen access to domestic long-term finance to increase the universe of investors in PPPs in Rwanda. One way to do that would be to ease unnecessary regulatory restrictions, limiting local currency financing of infrastructure by domestic banks. It should also be considered the possibility of revising the Rwanda Social Security Board law or the investment policy to allow investment in infrastructure. The second way, in fact, to improve the domestic private sector financing could be to use innovative financing solutions. What the minister also presented, the risk sharing facility, setting up a risk sharing facility to unlock financing from the local banking sector. For example, a risk sharing facility could absorb a percentage of loss on loans made to private projects. And this type of mechanism can be financed by development partners, including the World Bank, that has experience with these types of tools, this type of instrument in many countries. The last recommendation is about promoting a proper infrastructure strategy. Rwanda will need to rebalance its investment strategy from prioritizing large strategic capital-intensive projects toward projects critical for broad-based social return in order to boost the potential of public infrastructure to reduce inequality and poverty. So this can be done by taking steps toward the Malabo commitment that's calling to allocate 10% of the future infrastructure investment to agriculture-aligned activities and rural infrastructure. Thank you so much for your attention. This presentation will be made available to all the participants. And of course, the report itself will be available online on the World Bank website. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Calvin. Thank you for a very rich and thorough presentation. As an interlude to our next item on the agenda, I would like to invite you to watch a short video, a kind of recap of the presentation that Calvin has just made. Over to Nadesh.
Hi, Nadej, we're not hearing any sound.
Rogers, we can't hear you. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hello?
Can hear you, Roger. Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. Sorry, the sound of the video, apologies, the sound of the video is not good, something must have happened, but we're going to put it on the YouTube and people can watch it properly. Our next and last item this evening is a panel discussion, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator this evening, Amina Arif. Amina Arif is the IFC country manager for Burundi, Kenya, Malawi, Rwanda, Somalia, Tanzania, and Uganda. She's a Pakistan national, and she joined IFC in 2012 after building a very good long career in commercial banking with the Citibank, ABN, Amro Bank. And most recently, Amina has been the IFC country manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives, based in Colombo. Before I hand over to Amina for the discussion, I would like to remind our participants on WebEx and YouTube that the questions and the comments are welcome during the discussion throughout the discussions and through the chats, including members of the private sector, even though we're planning to have a private sector specific presentation of this report for in-depth discussion with them. They can still send in through their questions. Over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Rajas. Can you just remind us how much time we have for this so that we can work?
We have something like 45 minutes.
Okay. Delighted to be here and welcome to our esteemed panelists. I think, again, Roland has briefly introduced them, but let me go back and just sort of welcome them again. Ambassador Gadetti, and of course, Minister of Infrastructure, from whom you heard a very strong keynote address. We have Mrs. Claire Akamanzi, who's the CEO of the Rwanda Development Board. And then, of course, we have Mrs. Amina Rwakunda, who is the Chief Economist at the Ministry of Finance. We are also joined by our World Bank colleague, Alan Dennis, who is based in Nairobi and has a wide sort of range of experience across this region. So he's going to be joining us on the panel as well. So welcome, everybody. Let me kick it off really with an open question to the panel. And actually, let me start first with perhaps Alan, just because he's World Bank Group, and I think he should come first here. So Alan, you heard, like many other countries, Rwanda's fiscal space has depleted as a result of sort of dire impact of the pandemic that we've seen. The country faces the challenge of having to spend more to respond to the continuing crisis and to, build that development base, the infrastructure base, to fill the infrastructure deficit that is needed to sustain long-term growth. So can you help us understand, please, what can Rwanda learn from other countries facing similar circumstances, given your experience in the region and beyond? So I'll pass it on to you. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Amina, for that question. Just confirming that you can hear me clearly. Can you? Okay, excellent. Okay, yes. What Rwanda is facing is obviously a global situation, because since no country was left behind when it came to the impacts of COVID. And so all countries, and particularly most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are wrestling with this same question on how is it that, we all have dreams. We want to reach middle income status or high middle income or even a high income status. We know we need to increase our competitive environment. That definitely will call for infrastructure spending. There's urbanization happening, there are health crises. All of this calls for infrastructure. But at the same time, we've also seen that big hit to our revenue basis. So how do we match these things? And so it's a question that we all have to wrestle together. And I'm just going to put forward, a few thoughts on this. I know we'll go into greater detail in the discussion, but I will start from the very basics, which is, first, let us use the resources that we already have more efficiently. Within the context of the crisis, we've talked about let's build back better. Now, building back better will also call us to look very hard, for all countries, to look very hard at whatever meager resources we have in the past and how we've spent it. And are there ways to be able to spend that even more efficiently? Let me be a bit more practical on this before I move to the second part, which talks about bringing in other resources. In many countries across this region, we see governments spending quite a lot in the area of public investments. But when you dig into details, what do? You see a lot of projects that are scattered around, that are stalled, a lot of projects that have high overrun costs. You have a lot of projects where the execution rates are very low, and therefore the cost of implementation has been very high. This speaks to one thing. It speaks to the fact that the framework for public investment management itself is not strong enough, and therefore it leads to a lot of inefficiency. In other words, with those same resources, one could have gotten a lot more. A country in this neighborhood we worked on recently shows that about 1.6% of GDP in fiscal savings alone can be saved and used for other projects if there was more efficiency in the way it's used. So when we talk about building back better, I think COVID gives us the opportunity to let's look at even the little that we have, and let's look at, where there have been leakages and how can we better improve. And I can speak more to that, but I just wanted to give you a bit of flavor on that. The second area, of course, is even with that, let's say you maximize your efficiency, as some of Calvin's charts have shown, even when you maximize that, the fact is the infrastructure needs are huge. The population is growing very fast. So you're still going to need it. And the government's balance sheet is not sufficient to back up all these infrastructures. So there is no question, I believe, in any of our minds that the private sector will have a significant role to play in terms of bringing it. Now, a little bit of factoid here. At least on a global scale, there is a lot of global, I would say an excess of global savings. There's a glut of global savings. In other words, there's a lot of potential investment out there. I mean, there are trillions of dollars that are earning next to 0% in interest. So the question is, how do you, every country will have to ask that question, how do you make your environment such that the holders of this capital will find your environment attractive enough so that that capital will come in here? And I do think that that capital can come into the public infrastructure that is needed. The question is how. Now, Calvin has talked about some of these things, and I hope that this panel we can go into greater details. But let me just, spill out just three areas. Regulations. Capital will go to a place where it feels secure. If there's uncertainty, it's not going to go there. So you have to make sure your domestic regulatory environment is pretty solid. Whether we are talking about PPP or other forms of, private investment coming in, people need some sort of assurance. So the regulatory environment for me is number one, and we really need to look at those. Of course, nothing happens accidentally, so you need an institutional environment that can support this. I mean, Rwanda has done excellent, at least compared to most African countries when we talk about FDI. And I believe it's because you have RDB, which has focused a lot on this. But can we have that sort of institution that also focuses to be able to bring in that capital, this excess of global savings I'm talking about, into countries like Rwanda as well as other countries in sub-Saharan Africa? The other area I can mention is de-risking. De-risking is really important to be able to de-risk investment because, most investments in sub-Saharan Africa, they're going to be first movers who are going to do this. If nobody has done it before, investors are always going to be a little bit intrepid, will I succeed? And so there's going to be a need for de-risking. And this is where institutions such as the World Bank and other MDBs can play a role in de-risking that. The last point that I will make is on the domestic capital markets. Yes, we definitely need foreign savings to come in, but we also need to develop the domestic capital markets. And I hope in this discussion we can go into greater detail. My last point I should say, though, is that yes, by all means, let's attract private capital, but let's also be wary because the seeds that you sow today, even in a private capital space, can become your problem tomorrow on the fiscal problems. If you don't have the right mechanisms, you'll be laden with all kinds of payments to the private sector, and then it becomes a fiscal contingency liability. So let me stop there. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I think that was very comprehensive. If I can, you touched on some of the biggest points, which is that you need that framework for investment to be improved, and it's the efficiency, not just the fact that we want to bring in private capital, but also that we want to bring in that level of efficiency in there. And you're right, the scale of the issue is huge. The scale of the investment needs are massive. So how do we make sure we get our share and Rwanda's fair share, of the global savings that are out there? How do we make ourselves attractive enough? So I think that's a great segue to the next question, which I'm actually going to open up to our panelists, to Claire and Ambassador Gadetti and Amina. We're all sort of, one thing that's clear from the discussions, from the presentation, is that we have to be able to mobilize private sector financing to close the infrastructure gap. Okay. I think Roland mentioned, and then again, Calvin stressed that even if we maximize every grant and government borrowing and raise taxation to the highest level possible, it's still only going to provide 45% of the resources that we need for infrastructure investment, just for the infrastructure gap. So from each of your perspectives, what do you think can or should be done to attract more private sector financing for infrastructure? How do we make us as a destination for that private capital to flow into our infrastructure gaps and help fill them? So I'll pass it on to you. I don't know, Claire, would you like to kick us off, or?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. I hope I can be realistic.
Wait. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Ambassador, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes, from our perspective, let me tell you what we think and what we have experienced along the way. Maybe let me start from the last question that the past discussant, Mr. Assad was mentioning. There is a lot of global savings, excess, earning zero, some of them almost fearing to be earning negative interest. In Rwanda, we've tried to do as much as possible that is right in terms of providing the good environment. We've done several reforms now for the past, I don't know, since 2020. We've been doing reforms. If you see all the IMF and World Bank documents, you can't finish a document without seeing the word reform. And we've been reforming taxation, areas of incentives, making it easier for anybody to come and invest. We've provided incentives. We've tried to de-risk. But what we've seen in reality is that there is so much money, but these people who have money, they only trust government. They want to negotiate your government, they want to provide a loan to government, but not the private sector. And this has been really going on for quite a long time, whereby the one who is having hold on money to come to a country, trust a private individual or trust a private company, whether it is abroad or this country, it becomes a big problem. And that's why in most cases, we've been having a certain problem. Let me give you just an example of energy. World Bank and others, the African Development Bank, are pouring a lot of money in energy. That is transmission, distribution, and access. But when you try to mobilize the private sector to come and invest in generation, you find that the private sector is getting very expensive resources. And yet it is guaranteed that all the energy it produces, we are going to buy. So meaning, whether it is domestic, whether it is a foreign company, they are all facing the same problem. Hakan is facing the same problem of getting cheap resources, and yes, it's producing 80 megawatts. The Kivuwatt, 26 megawatts, is really suffering to go alone at a very high cost. If you go to many others, they are also facing the same thing. This is a mix of domestic and foreign companies. So meaning there is something that is wrong somewhere, whereby we are given money to be able to implement, to do the distribution of electricity, but the generation is expensive, and that expensiveness is going to reflect into the cost of energy. And that's why recently we've been talking to IFC for now the last 2.5 years to say, how can you help us? Now that we absorb all the energy, can you help us to make sure that you refinance some of these production so that we can get cheap energy? Because once you refinance them, and there are guarantees that it is a government company that is going to buy all the energy, why can't you refinance them at cheaper rate? And then it will be a win-win situation, meaning we get cheap energy and also investment increases because we are getting cheap energy, then we can do more investment in that sector. That's just an example where there is something that we cannot understand. Another thing is, which maybe we can also improve, is of course harmonization of investment. In other words, just for the same example of energy, if we get, for example, support, cheap loan from the World Bank and others on energy, how can we work together to ensure that also the production, there is also resources, because I know that the World Bank has a private sector window. I know that there is IFC. The same thing with African Development Bank. There is also the private sector window. But that private sector window can accompany this investment and give money to the private sector to do the investment, because this time the risks are minimal. So if we harmonize that kind of investment, it will be very useful. Another thing is also what we are trying to do here, that is also, I would say, creating results, is coordination of the investment. Meaning, if, for example, in the east and the west of Rwanda, where we have livestock, if World Bank is supporting or another, our government or another investor is supporting the government on productivity of agriculture, then this one also, we must work together to see that also there must be a road for transportation, there must be water, there must be electricity. We've seen it to increase the milk treatment plants. Definitely, they need electricity, they need water, they need roads to transport their milk, they need all this. So if we don't invest together, then it becomes another problem. We have also seen, of course, where you invest in productivity, like in agriculture, but you don't invest in infrastructure. How can a project, every project, for example, going to agriculture, say, well, let's have the combination, infrastructure together with productivity. So that way then, you have something that is more long-term lasting. Maybe lastly, I could see that somehow we are still working out in terms of de-risking. We've seen that it pays off. In Rwanda, where we have been doing some kind of providing the incentives for the companies which are producing at very little, less than 50% capacity, providing incentives to do that by actually foregoing taxation so that it can help these companies to increase. Because we have a difficult situation. We talk about high debt, but if you don't invest, you don't get the growth that you need to actually produce the businesses that you want. Meaning that you cannot raise your taxes. You cannot increase your taxes if you don't do the investment. A bad investment, the use of the investment, a bad loan is the one that you use for consumption. But if you are using it for production, and you know that this one is going to impact heavily on the growth of the economy, then you are creating a business. Or investing in infrastructure such as road, which is going to create an opportunity for trade and accelerate. Or electricity, that's going to increase productivity. Or water, which is needed. So these ones here, if you do that, then you know that it's going to impact on economic growth. But if you don't invest and they say, let me stop lending because the ratio is very high, okay, you have a high loan, you don't have the domestic resources because taxation are not going up. How do you solve the problem? So for me, those are the kind of few ideas I can give. But what I see that is very important is for us to be working together, and especially the coordination in how to provide support or loans that are cheap to the private sector so that they can make heavy investments. That way, I have not seen, it's still a problem. Even those that are coming in, they are still getting resources which are very expensive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gatete. Appreciate that. Claire, can we come to you?
Thank you very much, Amina, Honorable Minister, and all the colleagues on the panel, and thank you to the World Bank for organizing this. So I think what I want to focus on are 2 points in terms of what we can do to attract more private capital in the infrastructure space. I think, first of all, we've talked about, I think Alan Dennis did talk about regulatory framework. And I think one of the points is really strengthening and consolidating our business climate in order to attract private sector. And the second one I want to focus on is the public-private partnership framework that we've put in place in Rwanda as a structure of attracting private capital, especially in the infrastructure space. First of all, I think Rwanda has recognized the need to put in place a framework to attract private capital. And I think the very fact that Rwanda Development Board was put in place with a focus on putting in place an environment to attract private sector is really in recognition that public spending is insufficient for the development goals that the country has, and private sector must be mobilized to complement that. So on the first point on the business climate, yes, it's true. And I think the presentation and the report that the World Bank did, we do recognize that Rwanda has done a lot of reforms to make Rwanda a conducive business environment. We're ranking second to Mauritius today and 38th globally in terms of the ease of doing business. And I think that needs to be, sustained, and that needs to continue. However, I think the part that we really want to focus on in improving our business climate is really the cost of doing business, in addition to the ease of doing business in the country. And the cost of doing business in the country, when it comes to cost of infrastructure, cost of electricity, cost of transportation, cost of capital, and all those elements that actually improve the balance sheet of companies that are coming to invest in the country. And I think investing in infrastructure is also very critical in addressing those costs that we want to address in order to have those spillover effects in other sectors, as the World Bank report also recognized, whether it's manufacturing, services, or agriculture. So I think the first thing that I wanted to focus on is really how do we really address this issue of cost of doing business in the country as the next chapter of really making Rwanda even more attractive, in addition to all the successes that we've had in the business climate before. My second point is on the PPP framework. I think, yes, we've talked about, the need to attract private sector to complement public spending. And the PPP framework has been, at least for the last few years that we've focused on that, a good channel of bringing private capital in the country, especially in the infrastructure space. And I think Minister Gatete did give a number of examples on that. Today, we have about 58 projects that have closed in the PPP framework. 21% of those are already operational, so their goods and services are on the market. 79% of those are in different levels of implementation. Altogether, we see a project value of about 1.8 billion, which is significant, but definitely a lot more can be done to attract even more projects in this space, especially because when you look at the 58 projects that we've attracted in the PPP framework, more than 90% of those are in the energy sector. So we need to see other sectors coming in as well, whether it's transportation, housing, irrigation, waste, among others. But why is PPP very important for us if we think about attracting private capital? I think, one, we've seen that private sector can help with proper resource allocation and mobilization, and they can indeed support in filling some of the funding gaps that have been very clearly demonstrated by Calvin in his presentation. But also, in addition to filling the funding gap, we've also seen that the expertise and the efficiencies that the private sector brings is also a critical, important addition to what the government is doing, and we should really be tapping into that as well. And of course, value for money. We see that the private sector is more incentivized to make sure that projects are finished on time and on budget, because it really has a direct link on their returns or even the investors' returns that they're looking to bring in. So that makes the PPP framework one really big component if we're to think about attracting private sector money into the infrastructure space. Now, in Rwanda, we put in place a framework to make this possible. We have PPP law. We have PPP guidelines that were developed in 2016, and RDB has a department that focuses on, the whole, A to Z of the PPP framework. From initiating projects to preparing projects, documentation, selection to the final stages of PPP. So I think that institutional framework, in addition to the law and the guidelines for PPP, was very important for us in Rwanda. And this is why we've been able to see a number of projects coming up in this area, even though, as I said, these need to be diversified. Now, we've put in place ways of de-risking these projects in the negotiations that we've had with the private sector. We've given tax incentives where appropriate. We've also given some guarantees, some offtake commitments, but also some payment guarantees where necessary. And in the process of negotiating or structuring these PPP deals, we've seen that these components have, kind of brought the potential to actually close that deal much faster, other than just relying on, attracting private sector without putting in place these de-risking incentives that are very crucial. Now, in terms of what needs to be improved going forward, especially focusing on PPPs, I think that we've started as a country to put in place the right framework. We've seen the results. We've seen projects coming up as a result. But going forward, and I think to agree with some of the points that were raised by the World Bank, it's important to have to invest in doing the right feasibility studies so that we have the right bankable projects ready for the private sector. When the World Bank makes a recommendation like we should do a lot more competitive bidding and not unsolicited bids, I think part of the reason that we do unsolicited bids is because a project comes and you haven't prepared for it, you don't have a feasibility study for it, you haven't, you don't have you're not prepared. And so when an investor comes with a project that you haven't pre-anticipated, but it makes sense, you go for it. You don't lose the opportunity when it makes sense for the economy. But I think to reduce that and also to prepare better and even to analyze the project better, putting aside resources to do as many feasibility studies in the right priority projects makes it much easier. So when the private sector comes, there is something that you're actually going to be discussing. So I think that's the first point I wanted to focus on. The second one is really identifying and targeting the right partnerships. And again, a lot of investors will come, different capacities, different representations, and the quality of the investor that you select has a significant potential of how successful the project will be. If you don't select the right partners, the project doesn't have the high probability of being the right project or to be finished properly. So the selection of the partners that we have, I think, has to be very well done. And to make sure that you really get the right partner, you do the right due diligence, you can actually see their capacity, both in terms of expertise, track record, financial capacity, and being able to do that very well, I think increases the chances of having a successful project at the end of the day. And there's some good examples we've had, and I think Minister Gatete talked about some of them. Qatar Airways for the airport project, Dubai Ports for the Kigali Logistics Platform, Africa 50 for the Kigali Innovation City. And so trying to get a good pipeline of investors that have a good track record and good capacity and good reputation, I think is very important in ensuring success when we do them. The last point, maybe the second last point that I want to make is also strengthening the governance of projects. And I think this also did kind of come out in the report the World Bank prepared, which is how do we make sure that after you've done the deal and you've done your due diligence as much as you can, you actually have a strong accountability platform. So projects are actually done according to the expectations that we had, whether it's the timing, how the quality of the project when they're finished, the timelines, and also the budget or the commitments that were made. So putting in place a project governance framework to monitor on a timely basis so that these projects are actually completed as quickly or as expected, I think is also really important. The last one is we can put in place laws, we can put in place guidelines, we can put in place all these frameworks, but I don't think that the government would ever anticipate fully what the market needs to become successful. And so some level of being, business-like, transaction-based, and flexible in negotiating PPPs is very important. Many times we don't anticipate the things that will actually make a deal close. And we have to be, flexible, but also ready to do the analytical work to really see what requires a successful project. An example is the 4G LTE network that we had in partnership with Korea Telecom, where we had never thought of, giving spectrum for 4G and other generations of connectivity in a wholesale fashion. It was always about giving frequency to a company that does both retail and wholesale. But then in the discussions and in analytical work, to make the deal work, we had to come up with a wholesale approach, which at the time was the relevant way to actually get this deal closed. So being able to have that level of transactional thinking and approach at the same time bringing in some flexibility, I think is continuously going to be required to be able to attract private capital for the infrastructure space. So Amina, I'll stop there for now and thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was great. I think, and it sort of brought us back full circle to where Alan started, which is, saying the framework is so important. And I think that framework is not just in the structuring and putting together of the transaction, but also in the monitoring and the regulating of those projects once they come on board to make sure that we're getting what we want out of it, as the government and the people of Rwanda. Amina, over to you.
Thank you, Amina, and I'm not going to repeat what the Honorable Minister of Infrastructure said and also the CURDB. Just to add on some of the initiatives that the Ministry of Finance, the government is working on to make sure that we try to broaden the different sources of financing for infrastructure, but also to come up with instruments and ways of leveraging public resources to attract more private investment and also to manage investment risk attached to that partnership with the private sector. So we are assessing a framework for a blended finance within the Ministry of Finance and how we can actually meet concessional and non-concessional financing and to invest on key infrastructure project. So this is a conversation that we're having with development partners. It's advanced, and we hope that at the end we have instrument and a structure of financing that will fit really the purpose of Rwanda. We are also looking at infrastructure bond and also at district level, how we can also do municipal bond through the capital market. But of course, we have to take those district administration through a process where we check their financials. They have to get a rating of credit worthiness, really to become solvable and ready to partner with the private sector. Another source of financing for infrastructure project, and where also we can attract private investment, is looking at how we can integrate sustainability in infrastructure project, because we are seeing more and more that there are financing that are available at global level. They are just looking at those sustainability aspects. And to tap into those financing, of course, we have to integrate and implement sustainability principle in different infrastructure project. And with regard to that, actually the framework is advanced in Rwanda. We have already a framework in place, but we are looking at how we can improve further that framework so that Rwanda become attractive for green financing. Another area where we are also working together with development partners is a better project preparation with detailed feasibility study. So the project is ready for a pitch to potential investors. So it's very important, and we've seen appetite from development partners to finance that process. And I'm sure that it will also help attract and increase private sector financing. And of course, we have SOEs that are also supporting government into its development agenda. So we have to make sure that we are improving on SOEs governance, as the study said, and so that they can actually take on some of the debt on their balance sheet, and they will not just, always require a guarantee or a support from the government. What is also very important, and is a conversation that we've been trying to have with multilateral development banks, is to look at the existing financing instrument and assess if they are enough, if they are doing enough, and if they are still, serving the purpose of, developing countries that are facing mounting challenges in infrastructure financing, but also trying to invest in other sectors. So this is an area where we would like to have World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other development institutions to look at, because we are seeing low appetite or low uptake in Africa, and maybe those are instruments that are not really fitting the purpose, and that will is another area that can bring a change in the financing landscape of infrastructure in Africa. And of course, we have to keep an eye on macro stability, fiscal sustainability. We keep improving our business environment, because those are the foundation for attracting private sector investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Amina. I have a slew of questions I want to ask about prioritization and which sectors we go to, given our scarce resources. How do we focus? Where do we make sure we get the most sort of bang for our buck? But I'm going to ask one last question, and if I can ask it of you, Amina, before I open it up, because we do have participants, who've joined the session, and I want to make sure we get to some of their questions. But one very quick sort of response from you, if I can ask for, is, we've seen that the report shows that infrastructure investments are generating lower returns for the poorest in Rwanda. So what can be done to ensure that the public infrastructure investment contributes to the reduction of inequality, the reduction of poverty levels in Rwanda? Just a quick response from you on that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. But of course, the process will always be to try to understand the needs of the poor, where they are, in which sector they are in, and what are the potential sector for graduation for them. And once they've graduated, what is there for them? We have actually to make sure that once they graduated, they can be able to, to access opportunities that are available on the market and be able to generate an income sustainably. And for that's where the challenge comes for the government, because you have, yes, to lift people out of poverty, but you have also to maintain them out of poverty, to make sure that they're not returning into poverty. And for that, you have to invest in different types of infrastructure, not only those infrastructure that are linked to agriculture, where you have many of our population, and where actually there is a big number of poor. Not only just rural infrastructure, but you have also to keep improving to make the economy more productive, to improve on the capacity of the economy to become more productive, and productive for the people, so that they can, once they graduate, they join an economy that is strong, that can provide job for them. They can keep, earning an income over time. So that's actually the challenge not only Rwanda have, but also developing countries. We have so many gaps in many sectors, and with the small cake, the small resources we have to try to invest in different sector to make sure that once you have those people out of poverty, so there is other infrastructure that they will need to sustain and remain out of poverty. So it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's very challenging for the government. But of course, we have to continue investing in infrastructure that are bringing people out of poverty. And this is what actually the government is doing by investing in electricity, in water and sanitation, in ICT to connect also people, roads. So those are in irrigation. So it's actually helping more people to get out of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arvind.
Can I come in, moderator?
Please, sir.
Yeah, I just want to, unfortunately, I haven't read the whole full report to understand how this one is not helping the poverty reduction. Let me just give you maybe 3 examples. The road construction that we had from the southern part, from a place called Huye to Chibeho, there was no link, there was no trade among that part. Now that with the road that is there, that is tarmac, it has not only increased the trade along the corridor, which is near the border with Burundi, it has also increased the tourism, because that's a religious area where people were struggling to go. And you have seen other investments in hotels and other infrastructure because of that road. The same thing for the also another road from Nyagatare that is going to Basse, that is linking the east to the north, which is a very long road that we constructed with the support of the African Development Bank and also the Arab funds. That one, if you see the trade that is going on that road alone, it can really show you how much jobs were created, how much trade that is going on this time, rather than from the east going through Kigali and going to the north. This time they are selling everywhere, including Congo and Uganda and other places. So the impact is very heavy. If you go to the water, where we are building now, the rural area which had no water, just for one project of the African Development Bank and the European Investment Bank, we are now almost by the end of this December, we are completing 1,100 kilometers of the pipes that we are connecting to ordinary people in the rural areas, and 568 kilometers in the city of Kigali. In the rural areas, immediately once you build those kind of pipes, you start connecting water for the people who never had water. So you can imagine the impact it's having just for this one project that we are talking about. The same thing with electricity rollout, where in the rural area, just where we have increased the electricity rollout, and which is a focus. At this point in time, by the end of May, we are at 63% access, and we are targeting 74% access by June next year. But where the electricity has gone, if you see the improvement in electricity and how it has boosted the rural sector in terms of productivity, in the areas of tea, in the areas of milk production, in the areas of other things where they are now doing the processing for the SMEs, for the small micro industries that have really developed because of this. So that's why I don't understand how that was done, that's not having an impact. Maybe if you know the sector, if you know the area, definitely for us, what we are seeing is this has had a very significant impact.
Thank you, Master. No, I think our intention is not to say that it hasn't had an impact. Certainly, things like rural roads have an immediate impact on, some of the poorest in the population. So I don't think that the intention or the report is trying to say that the investments that have been made are not reducing it. Just that some of the investments possibly are helping urban areas perhaps more, or the better off in the urban areas more than the rural. But again, I completely take your point. I think investments in rural infrastructure are bound to help the, those that need the help the most. So let me come back and take a couple of questions that have come in on our various sort of YouTube and chats. And this question actually has come in for Roland and myself. And I'm going to read it out, and then Roland, perhaps you take first crack at it, and then I can come in. So the question reads, the minister stated Rwandan debt is for investment with returns well projected. However, financiers trust the government only. Are World Bank and IFC going forward, are they going to consider financing private companies to take up some of these infrastructure projects so that we reduce public debt burden to the government? Would you like me to start, or would you?
I'm quite happy to start because I think my answer is relatively easy. We generally, as the World Bank, in the World Bank group mix, right? In the World Bank group, we have sort of three main players that you would hear about: World Bank, IFC, and MIGA. And the World Bank part really focuses on supporting government reforms, government financing, etc. How we help the private sector directly or indirectly is through helping the government to create a strong business environment and enabling environment through reform programs, through technical assistance, but also, for example, through financing where, and I spoke about this in my opening, we do certain types of projects that will essentially allow for unlending to private firms. So the most recently approved access to finance for recovery and resilience project will help to further capitalize the Economic Recovery Fund. And these resources are essentially being made available to government for firms who could improve their capacity. In the first instances, firms in the manufacturing sector and the agriculture sector, but there is really no limit, and there is no sort of limit on size either. And so the World Bank resources were utilized to help to capitalize the Economic Recovery Fund. But through the project preparation, we collaborated with the government in designing the various windows and the various technical assistance approaches that would be used. And all of this would be financed through the project. So the money is not going directly from the World Bank to private sector, but through the government, private sector will have access to those resources. However, I'll turn over to Amina because IFC actually does provide resources directly to the private sector. Amina?
I would like to add something to what Roland said, Amina, if possible.
Please, please.
Yes, more on the World Bank side. So yes, whilst the World Bank or IDA does not provide directly to the private sector, there's a lot of work, much of which Roland has spoken to, that we do, which helps to crowd in private investment. And one thing we do, for example, is to de-risk. And one of the instruments that we use to de-risk is through guarantees. So for example, in the past, I think 2 months or so, there is a recent water sanitation project in the city of Rwanda, which the bank provided a guarantee. And as a result of that, it has attracted commercial financing into this public infrastructure, which is sanitation. We in Kenya, for example, are already working on what would be a major artery for East Africa trade. It will be a big PPP project. The World Bank is not providing finance per se in that, maybe IFC, but that we're working to see if we can support this through the provision of a guarantee. So the World Bank does provide guarantees, and usually that gives comfort and helps to de-risk the investment. Over.
Thanks, Alan and Roland. So let me come in very briefly and say, the entire purpose of IFC's existence is to finance these private sector companies that want to come in and do projects in our sort of partner countries. So that is the entire reason why IFC exists and why we're here, and that's what we'd like to do. I think the challenge for us sometimes is not the fact that we don't want to finance the private sector companies, or we don't have the resources. We do. We have the appetite, we have the interest, we have our defined role, which is to do that. The challenge sometimes becomes, and I'm going to go back to what Claire said, is finding those well-structured, viable projects. Okay, that's generally our biggest problem. Actually, let me add one more thing. So, viable, well-structured projects with credible sponsors. Okay, IFC on its own cannot come in. We are a DFI. We will come in to finance a public sector entity. We cannot come and set up a public sector company. We don't build or run roads or operate waste management systems. We will come in and finance them. But someone who knows how to do that, has a track record, is credible, can deliver within the cost, the timelines, the quality of the product or the service that is required. That's what we call a viable project. And when we talk about structuring and preparation, again, this is going back to what Claire and Ambassador Gatetti said also, you have to have those well-structured projects. Those risks that should belong or that are best placed with the public sector should be there, and the rewards should tie in with those. Those risks that the private sector can take should be passed on to the private sector, and those rewards should tie in there. That's what we mean by a well-structured project. We're not, the idea is not to let either the private sector, run amok and create other fiscal issues that Alan referred to earlier, or even that the ambassador referred to. We don't want to have endless payments for products or services that are too expensive or not of the right quality or not in the right place or just not the right product or service for us. So that's the whole sort of structuring process, if you will. So absolutely, we do stand ready. We would like to expand our program in Rwanda. We would like to support credible private sector partners who come in and do viable projects. That's what we're there for. So I know we've run out of time already, but if I can have one last question, and perhaps I can go back to Claire for this, and and the ambassador, and just sort of ask you for one last comment on prioritization, or the what Ambassador you referred to earlier, and I know we didn't get a chance to go into it deeply, but if you would like to make a comment or a closing remark on capital markets, and the role that they can play in helping us to bridge this infrastructure financing gap. So perhaps the ambassador and then Claire.
Yeah, usually ladies first, so I don't know if I can go ahead with permission of Claire.
Claire.
Minister Gatete, you go ahead now that you need my permission at the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claire, for this. In as much as we've been talking about resources coming to support the government and the private sector from outside, especially, because those are coming from the international financial institutions, the resources which are coming from the development finance institutions. We have a whole list from Europe, from North America, from everywhere, that also they provide cheap financing and supplement what the international financial institutions and others provide us. There is also the domestic angle. And here, this is where the government has been trying to really trying to develop some of the resources that are needed. One of them that we didn't have initially was the establishment of the capital market so that companies can be able to raise money, as they normally do in any of the developed countries, raising money from the stock exchange and also participating so that you can get long-term resources. we know that was a burden not only for the investors, it was also a burden for the banking system. Because when I was still at the central bank, I remember there's a time whereby the money that you would want, that you have, you find that 70% at the time it was 72%, was demand deposit, meaning it is the money which can be withdrawn anytime. And that's not a situation that is sustainable because it was only deposit money mainly. And later on, of course, products were developed and now they have improved significantly. And that's why the role of the capital market is necessary to provide the long-term financing. But also find that other institutions like the pension has also been restructured in such a way that you would have the normal pension, but also other long-term savings that would also help you in the pension. The one we have, like, for example, Ejo Heza, where the private sector, the individual people are really investing into that kind of instrument. We have established the Rwanda National Investment Trust that is really doing extremely well. We have another one from, I would say from BK Capital, Abuka Unit Trust, and then, of course, the Agaciro Development Fund. This has not happened for a long time. It's just a multiple of some of the resources that are being created, of the investments that can be used to finance. And most recently, of course, wanting Rwanda to become a financial hub, there are many funds that have been attracted. The laws have been, massive laws have been put in place to make sure that we can attract so many other resources. And with these resources, then it's not only the debt, it is also the equity that can be put into some of these projects that are being developed in Rwanda. So for the last few years, there was massive reforms, there was massive initiatives that have been put in place to make sure that apart from, there's a time we are relying almost on the reserves of the central bank, even to calm the market, to make sure that you can stabilize the whole entire private sector needs. But now, at least with so many funds, including the Agaciro Development Fund, have been put in place to make sure that it's no longer the banking system. Now we have the capital market, which we are developing progressively. But at the same time, we have so many other funds that are coming in, including some of the international funds that are really reaching here to have their headquarters here in Rwanda. And with that kind of mix, we believe that these resources would end up supporting the private sector to invest in many areas, including infrastructure. I think that's what I can say for now, as far as the Rwanda initiatives are concerned. But I think what we need is really the support of the World Bank and other institutions on how we can professionalize and support our capital market. Because at the end of the day, it is the capital market that is going to help and lead in terms of providing the long-term resources from wherever the resources are, bring them to Rwanda, and also being in Rwanda, they are invested and supporting our private sector. I think that's what I can say for now, but Claire has been hustling with it for a long time. I think she can be able to nail it down.
Thank you, Minister. Maybe in addition to the examples you've given, I think one that I'm really looking forward to see how it performs is the recent announcement by a local energy company called Energy Cotel that issued a 10-year corporate bond, hoping to raise $6.5 million, not just to refinance the existing loan, but also for the expansion. And I think that demonstration by a private company raising money on the capital market locally, I think getting more of those and encouraging more of those, I think is something that would be great going forward. But the last point that I wanted to finish with is our new investment code. We have a new investment code that was enacted beginning of this year. And it does really demonstrate what the government has chosen as priority sectors. And you will find that the infrastructure subsectors are really very much present in terms of where the government is allocating incentives and hoping that these incentives catalyze more investments. For example, the incentives around the Kigali International Financial Center are very, very, I think, very, very attractive. And the idea is to be able to attract different ways of mobilizing money for the market. Because of that, some of the negotiations that I know Rwanda Finance is negotiating includes infrastructure funds that are coming to dedicate their work on just infrastructure. So I think the Kigali International Financial Center and the incentives that are in the investment code is one key one to look at. And the other one is if you look at the types of incentives that have been given in the new investment code, again, you can see it's targeting big infrastructure projects. For example, a 7-year tax holiday is only allocated to projects that are $50 million and more, and most of those projects are in the infrastructure space. If you look at the corporate income tax incentives of 15%, it's mostly in those sectors such as energy, transportation, ICT, telecom, so sectors that are really very catalytic in terms of infrastructure that is needed to spearhead economic growth. So I wanted to end with that, and also maybe just to say, even for the economic recovery beyond COVID, some of the programs we put in place, such as manufacturing and build to recover, the target is to sustain jobs and also to make sure that the sectors that are very crucial for job creation, such as construction, housing, infrastructure, are really the ones that are getting all these incentives that we put in place on a temporary basis for the post-COVID recovery. So I'll just end with that again, and thank you very much for putting this together to the World Bank.
Thanks very much, Claire. I think that was, the perfect note to end on, in terms of not only do we have to build back better, we have to build back more sustainably, we have to build back in, we have to make sure we invest our scarce resources in priority sectors. And thank you very much for that. So with this, I'm going to pass it to Rogers and Roland to close up the session for us. Thank you again to our panelists and for their patience.
Thank you so much, Amina. I first, of course, want to thank all the participants for their interest and for the questions. We never ever have enough time, no matter how much we sort of try to extend, we never have enough time with our panelists. There's always more interest and questions than we do have time. Specifically, also, I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers, Ambassador Gatete, Claire Akamanzi, of course, Amina Rakunda, who of course is a regular at our launch of the economic update, and Alan Dennis, who stood in for Assad Alam, our regional director, who was called away at the very last moment for another important meeting. The quality of the dialogue was definitely a function of the strength of the panel that we have, and that's why persons keep coming to these REU launches, because they know that we are going to be able to offer them through these very strong panelists that we are able to invite and who accept our invitations. And today it was again one of those moments. I would also like to thank the World Bank team members, including our collaborators from the IFC who authored and contributed to this report, and for my own team in Kigali and in the region that supported the logistics for this successful event. I'd also like to close the launch with a few reflections. One, that this move that we keep speaking of, the shift from large public investment to private sector and human capital development as the main drivers of economic growth, is very much something that is central to Rwanda's national strategy for transformation. And really a lot of our conversation has been about how the government will go about that. I think what was interesting was, in addition to some of the issues that the World Bank put on the table, there are a lot of very key and notable points that the panelists also raised in terms of what more could be done and what is needed. And some of these, the minister's own comments around the framework for public investment management, improving the framework for public investment management, and specifically being able to find resources for private sector companies that are less expensive to enable them to come in and do what is needed with regards to infrastructure. Because of course, infrastructure needs are great. These projects are large, generally for the long term, and would be more beneficial to the end user and to the developer himself if they were able to, or herself, if they were able to access resources that were less expensive. I think another very important point that resonated was this move away from unsolicited bids, and Claire's point that the government would be better able to do that if there is a stronger project preparation pipeline for PPPs. Amina also mentioned that, and essentially concurred with that position. And that is something that we, of course, at the bank are happy to speak more about, to see if there's a way that we can help strengthening the governance for projects once they're on the ground, so that before it becomes a huge problem, you're able to manage small challenges along the way. and targeting the right partnerships. That was also a statement that was resonated, ensuring that partners are persons with capacity, with good reputation, with a strong track record, to ensure, therefore, that the quality of the outcome, the output, the final thing is going to be of high quality and strong for the benefit of Rwanda and Rwandans. I think also the deepening of the domestic capital market. And here the minister and Claire brought a lot of examples as to how the government is looking at that. We have also some suggestions in the economic update, but this is clearly seen as an area that we can tap into, something that we could probably do more of and better in order to be able to ensure that there are additional resources in the market. And of course, finally, something that we all care about, ensuring that there is strong macro stability, strong fiscal stability, as this is critical to manage risk of the government and critical to enable to continue to have an attractive environment for investors to want to come and invest in Rwanda. We thank you so much for the quality of the debate. I can say to you that these conversations will continue because we will have many dissemination events for academia, for the private sector and others. We will post some of these on social media with our partners who are helping us host these events. Thank you very much for taking the time. And we'll see you in another 6 months when we will launch the Rwanda Economic Update number 18. Take good care.